I raised my children in that house. With late-night soup when they were sick birthday parties, I planned down to the last balloon. So when my son called to say dinner's canceled, Mom, you're not invited, I believed him. Until I found them all, gathered without me, smiling, toasting, as if I never existed. My name is Marjorie Glenn. I'm 78, and this isn't a story of revenge. It's about the moment I stopped waiting to be remembered and quietly reminded them who I am. Stay with me, because sometimes the most powerful thing a mother can do is to stop giving everything and choose herself instead. Mornings in Willowbrook have a softness to them, like the town itself has learned to move slower with age. At 78, I appreciate that kind of stillness. The sun rises behind the church steeple just past the square, and the light filters into my kitchen through the same lace curtains Thomas hung nearly 40 years ago. They're yellowed now, like everything in this house, but I've grown to love that faded look. It suits me. The house creaks a little more these days, especially when I move from one room to the next. My knees protest and my back occasionally stiffens like it's forgotten how to bend. Still, I get by. I don't need much. I have my morning tea, the garden in the back, and the birds who visit the railing every dawn like they've signed some unspoken agreement to keep me company. This house, our house, holds the shape of every memory I've ever cherished. Thomas built it with his own hands. I still remember the weekend he finished the wooden banister, smoothing it with sandpaper until it felt like silk beneath my palm. He always said he'd fix the loose step on the porch, too, but he never did, and I never pushed him about it. That creaky step is one of the last sounds I still hear from him. He passed away on a rainy Wednesday, 8 years ago. One minute he was in the garden pruning the hydrangeas, and the next he was gone. His heart simply gave out. I still talk to him every morning. It might sound silly to someone else, but I water the roses and tell him what the weather's doing, how many sparrows came by, and what kind of pie I might bake that week. There's comfort in continuity. Our children were raised here, Elliot and Daphne. I still see their shadows in the hallway, sometimes hear their laughter if I let myself be quiet enough. Elliot's room is now my sewing space, though I haven't stitched much in years. Daphne's old ballet slippers still hang from a nail inside the linen closet tucked between mothballs and the scent of old cedar. They don't visit much these days. Daphne calls once a month, quick breathless calls full of errands and excuses. She's got her shop, her clients, and 1,000 reasons why next weekend just won't work. Elliot stops by more often, but it's usually because he needs something. A signature, a spare key, a favor. He always says, "I'll return the favor soon, Mom." But time has taught me that soon is a word that doesn't belong to mothers. It belongs to everyone else. And yet, there's Owen, my grandson, 19 now in college, just an hour away, and taller than I remember each time I see him. He has his father's eyes, but none of his hurry. Owen is the kind of boy who shows up with a hug, a story, and an appetite for blueberry pie. He never needs a reason to come by, and for that alone I bake a pie every Wednesday. Not for me. I can't eat much sugar anymore. But for him, because he makes me feel remembered. I don't think Elliot or Daphne mean to be cruel. Life just took them. It swept them into calendars, mortgages, and parenting books. I was once in that storm too. I remember the chaos of lunches to pack, bills to stretch, and small hands tugging at my skirt. I gave everything I had to them. My time, my sleep, my youth. Thomas and I sacrificed vacations, career ambitions, and a more comfortable retirement so they could have dance lessons and braces and second chances. Sometimes I wonder if they ever noticed. This morning, like every morning, I brewed my tea and took it to the porch. The roses are blooming late this year, but they're coming in strong, pink and wild and proud. I sat in the rocking chair Thomas built, the one with the faded plaid cushion, and listened to the town stretch its bones. A mail truck rolled by. A dog barked in the distance. and for a moment everything felt exactly as it should. But there's a truth I don't like to admit even to myself: the house feels bigger lately. Not because it grew, but because I've shrunk. Not in size, but in role. I used to be the center of someone's world. Now I feel like a guest in my own life. Still, I don't wallow. I fold laundry. I sweep the kitchen. I write letters I never send. I listen to the radio when the quiet gets too heavy. I live, not out of habit, but because Thomas would want me to. Because Owen still shows up. Because some part of me still hopes. Hope is stubborn in women like me. It hides in teacups, folds itself into freshly ironed linens, and lingers in the smell of cinnamon baking in an empty kitchen. And even though my children don't ask me what I'm doing this weekend, or whether I'm eating well, or if the heater still works, I keep setting the table, just in case someone remembers I'm here. Wednesday mornings always feel a bit lighter, like the house knows Owen is coming. I started preparing the pie before sunrise, rolling out the dough slowly, deliberately. The way Thomas used to say made it flakier. I don't eat much of it myself anymore, not with the sugar and all, but baking for Owen is something I look forward to all week. It makes the place feel alive again. The scent of blueberries and cinnamon had just started to fill the kitchen when I heard the creak of the front gate, followed by the gentle thump of sneakers on the porch. I smiled before he even knocked. "Door's open," I called, wiping my hands on my apron. "Hey, Grandma," Owen said, stepping inside with that familiar mix of lanky awkwardness and warm confidence. He dropped his backpack by the door and walked straight into the kitchen like he belonged there. Which of course he did. I set a slice on his usual plate and poured him a glass of milk. "Still warm," I said. "Just for you." "You really didn't have to," he said, grinning as he dug in. "But I'm glad you did." He told me about his week, how he finally got his professor to remember his name, how he bombed a quiz on statistical inference but made up for it in creative writing, and how there's a girl named Brooke in his poetry class who laughs at his terrible rhymes. I laughed too, watching him eat like he hadn't seen food in days. He was halfway through his second slice when he looked up and said, "So, have you decided what you're wearing on Friday?" My smile faltered just for a moment. Friday. He blinked. "Yeah, the anniversary dinner. For Mom and Dad. 40 years. They booked the private room at Birchwood Inn. Fancy place." Something cold settled in my chest. I tried to keep my voice light. "Your father didn't mention anything to me." Owen's fork paused midair. "Really?" I thought. "He told me he was going to pick you up around 5. I just assumed." I shook my head gently. No one said a word. He frowned. "That's weird. Maybe he forgot. You know how Dad is. Last minute everything." Maybe I said, but the words felt hollow even in my own mouth. We didn't linger on it. Owen changed the subject. Started talking about a book he'd picked up for one of his electives, and I nodded along, but my mind had shifted. There was a silence inside me that felt unfamiliar. Not empty, but waiting. Listening. After Owen left, I sat at the table for a long while, the scent of pie still lingering. I hadn't even touched my slice. Around 3 p.m., the phone rang. The screen lit up with Elliot's name, and for a moment I felt relieved. Maybe it had all been a misunderstanding. Maybe he was calling with an invitation. "Hi, Mom," Elliot said, overly cheerful. "Just wanted to give you a quick heads up. We're canceling the dinner on Friday. Grace isn't feeling great. Doctor says bed rest for at least a week." I hesitated. "Oh no, I'm sorry to hear that. Do you need anything? I could bring over some soup or—" No, we're covered," he interrupted quickly. "Just thought I'd let you know." And just like that, he hung up. No explanation. No apology. Just a dial tone humming in my ear. I stared at the phone in my hand, my thoughts beginning to twist and turn in quiet confusion. If the dinner was canceled, why had Owen mentioned it as if it were still happening? Why had Elliot only just told me? So, last minute, something didn't add up. I reached for the phone again and called Daphne. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Mom," she said, her voice distracted the sound of traffic in the background. "Is Grace okay?" I asked. A pause. "Grace," Yes, Elliot said she's sick. That the dinner on Friday is off. I haven't talked to her in a few days, she replied, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice. But yeah, I'm sure she's just tired. You know how she gets. I see, I said quietly. Are you still going on Friday? Another pause. Longer this time. Oh, right. Yeah, I think so. I mean, if it's still on, I'll have to check. She mumbled something about bad reception and hung up before I could ask more. I sat in my armchair that evening, the sky outside turning the color of cold steel, and stared at the photo of our family above the fireplace. It was from a Thanksgiving 10 years ago. Everyone was there, everyone smiling. My hair had still been mostly brown then. I kept thinking about how quick Elliot had been to cut the call, how strange Daphne sounded, how Owen, sweet, honest Owen, had no reason to lie. I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. I just sat there with a feeling I couldn't quite name. A dull ache, like a bruise blooming beneath the skin, the kind you don't notice until someone presses on it. That night I didn't sleep much. I sat with the silence, letting it say what no one else would. Something was wrong. Not forgotten. Hidden. The morning after Elliot's call, I woke earlier than usual. Sleep had been nothing more than a restless rotation between pillows and old memories. Even the birds seemed late to rise. I stood at the sink long after my tea had gone cold, watching the street out front, waiting for the day to tell me what to do with it. Eventually, I put on a cardigan, slipped into my walking shoes, and left the house, not for groceries, not even for the post office. I just needed to move, to breathe air that hadn't been holding in my thoughts overnight. Willowbrook's downtown is just 6 blocks from my front porch, and walking there had always been a comfort. The sidewalks are uneven in places, roots from old trees cracking the concrete like nature's quiet protest. Shop windows still dress themselves seasonally, even if no one changes the displays anymore. I didn't have a destination, but my feet seemed to know where they wanted to go. I ended up near the flower shop on Maple and 2nd, the one where Daphne had worked part-time for the past 4 years. She never talked much about it, said she only did it to get out of the house and do something with her hands. I always thought she liked arranging flowers more than she let on. The shop's bell chimed softly as I stepped inside. The air smelled of eucalyptus, damp stems, and ribbon glue. It was comforting in a way, like walking into a memory that hadn't spoiled yet. Marjorie, a voice called from the back. I turned to see Frances Delaney, her apron smudged with soil and green foam hands full of tulips. Frances and I went to school together. Different grades, but the kind of women who always crossed paths at PTA meetings, bake sales, and holiday drives. Well, if it isn't the Glen matriarch herself, she smiled. Big celebration tomorrow, huh? My breath caught just slightly. Daphne told me she's taking the evening off. Frances went on cheerfully. Said it's some big anniversary thing. 40 years private room at Birchwood Inn, fancy stuff. You must be thrilled. There was a pause, the kind too small to be noticed by most people, but long enough for a mother's heart to split down the center. Oh, yes, I murmured, managing a nod. Of course. Frances didn't notice. She went back to prepping flowers, humming a tune I couldn't place. I thanked her, bought a small bouquet I didn't need, and walked out into the gray morning, the stems trembling in my hand. Birchwood Inn. The name echoed in my mind like a bell struck in an empty church. That's where Owen said the dinner would be. That's where Frances said the reservation had been made for weeks. That's where Elliot claimed Grace would no longer be going, because she was sick. I stood outside the shop for a long while, my fingers tightening around the brown paper bundle. The wind picked up, tugging at the edge of my scarf, and still I didn't move. It was all a lie. Not a mistake, not a miscommunication, a lie. They had planned this together. They had booked the restaurant, sent out invites, arranged rides. Even Daphne had requested time off. And all that time, not one of them thought I should be there. Or worse, they had thought it and decided not to. That's what stung. The deliberateness. I walked home slowly, each step heavier than the last, but with my mind sharper than it had felt in years. There was a cold clarity in the air around me now, like frost settling on glass. At home, I set the flowers on the counter and sat down at the kitchen table, the one Thomas built when we first moved in. My tea kettle whistled faintly behind me, but I didn't move to pour it. I didn't cry. I didn't pace the room. I didn't call anyone. Instead, I climbed the stairs and went to the closet. At the back, behind the coats, no one had worn in decades, hung a dress I hadn't touched in years. Navy blue. Simple. Dignified. The same one I wore to Thomas's funeral. It still held its shape. Still smelled faintly of lavender and starch. I ran my hand over the fabric and laid it gently across the bed, and then I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was older, of course, softer in some places, hardened in others. But my eyes, they were the same, clear, watchful, and now wide open. If they don't want me there, I whispered to my reflection, then I need to see why. Not to shame them, not to make a scene, just to know. Friday came, dressed in quiet. The clouds hung low, heavy with the kind of gray that made everything feel softer but sadder. I spent most of the morning in silence, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the hallway clock, the occasional creak of wood shifting in the walls. There was no anger in me, no storm, just a kind of solemn clarity, like a fog that had finally lifted after years of pretending I couldn't see the road ahead. I ironed the navy dress slowly, my hands remembering the movements, even if my wrists protested with each press. It still held its shape simple and clean, with soft pleats that brushed just below the knee. I had worn it to Thomas's funeral. The last time I truly felt both seen and invisible all at once. After I dressed, I looked in the mirror. My hair was thinner now, but I'd pinned it back neatly. I added a touch of blush, a little lipstick. Not to impress anyone, but to remind myself I still could. At exactly 4:45, I called a cab. The driver was young, barely older than Owen. He had earbuds in one ear and a tattoo of a sparrow peeking from under his sleeve. When I told him the address, he glanced at me in the rear-view mirror. "Swanky place," he said. "Birchwood Inn." "Special occasion, family reunion," I replied evenly, folding my hands in my lap. He didn't ask more. I was grateful for that. As we neared the restaurant, I tapped gently on the seat in front of me. "Could you stop just short of the main entrance?" He nodded, pulling into the side road that ran alongside the inn. The building stood like something from another time. Red brick ivy climbing the walls and strings of warm lights already beginning to twinkle around the eaves. The parking lot was tucked to the side, hidden from the front-facing windows. I stepped out and told the driver to wait, just in case I added, and he gave me a small nod before leaning back in his seat. The breeze was cool, but not biting. I walked slowly, deliberately around the side of the building, my shoes crunching against the gravel. The trees rustled above me, whispering nothing in particular. And then I saw them. Elliot's sleek silver sedan, Daphne's beige SUV, Owen's dusty old Honda, all lined up neatly in the guest parking lot. No mistake, no miscommunication. They were here. I stood for a moment, letting that truth settle deep into my chest like a stone in still water. Then I kept walking until I reached the side of the building where the banquet hall faced the river. The windows were tall and narrow, draped in ivory curtains that didn't quite meet in the middle, just wide enough to see through if you stood at the right angle. So I did. Inside, a large round table dominated the room, draped in white linen and adorned with small vases of roses, the kind of setting reserved for milestones. Champagne flutes clinked, laughter floated upward, and in the center of it all stood Elliot raising his glass in a toast. To his right sat Grace, glowing in a vibrant red dress, cheeks flushed with joy. She didn't look sick. She looked radiant, healthy, whole. Daphne was next to her, mid-laugh, leaning into the man beside her with a familiarity I hadn't seen in years. Owen was across the table, smiling at a girl with chestnut curls who must have been the Brooke he mentioned. Around them were faces I didn't know. Friends, in-laws, maybe co-workers. But all smiling, all included. Everyone was there. Except me. There wasn't even an empty seat. The knot in my chest didn't tighten. It just settled. Like the final piece of a puzzle you didn't want to finish but couldn't leave incomplete. I didn't cry. I didn't press my hand to the glass or whisper my name to no one. I just looked. Long enough to know that this was not a mistake. They hadn't simply forgotten. They had planned it this way. They had looked at this night, this celebration, this table, and decided I didn't belong at it. I turned from the window, my heels crunching the gravel again as I made my way around the building toward the main entrance. The inn's front doors gleamed with brass handles. The inside glowed with candlelight and warmth. A man in a navy vest stood by the entry, his name tag catching the light. "Good evening, ma'am," he said politely. "Do you have a reservation?" I met his eyes. "No, but I believe the Glenn family is celebrating tonight." He blinked once, then recognition softened his expression. "Of course. Please come in." The lobby smelled of rosemary and roasted lamb, and for a moment I was 16 again, walking into my first high school dance, unsure if anyone would look up, let alone see me. Marjorie. I turned at the sound of my name. It was Caleb Dorsey, owner of the Birchwood Inn, and once the boy who used to live 2 houses down from us. He looked older now, silver at his temples, but the same warm eyes and crooked smile. "You haven't changed a bit," he said kindly. "Oh, but I have," I replied. "And apparently so has my family." He paused, reading more in my voice than I meant to show. "They didn't invite you." I shook my head. "They went out of their way to make sure I stayed home." Another pause. Then, without a word, he offered me his arm. "Let's not keep them waiting," he said gently. And together we walked toward the banquet hall, toward the truth. The doors to the banquet hall opened without ceremony. No announcement, no music. Just a quiet hush as Caleb pushed them gently inward, revealing the room in full. Laughter floated midair like smoke, delicate and fleeting. And then, silence. You could feel it ripple across the room. Forks paused above plates, glasses, frozen mid-toast, conversations snapped off like twigs underfoot. A room full of people who had carefully curated their guest list, now staring at the name they'd left off it. Caleb didn't flinch. He walked beside me with the calm confidence of someone who had seen both the best and worst in people, and learned to expect either at any moment. I kept my gaze steady as we crossed the threshold, the heels of my shoes clicking softly against the wood floors. I saw them all, every face. Elliot was still standing, his champagne flute halfway raised, mouth slightly open as if caught between a laugh and a cough. Grace looked stunned, her red dress catching the candlelight in a way that felt almost cruel in contrast to the pale lie she had worn so easily. Daphne's wineglass trembled in her hand. The man beside her, the one I didn't recognize, reached out as if to steady her, but she didn't seem to notice. And then there was Owen. He stood up fast, nearly knocking over his chair. His eyes searched mine like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't know he'd been handed. "Grandma," he said, breathless. I gave him a small smile, a nod. Nothing more. He deserved that gentleness. But I didn't look away from Elliot. He recovered first. Always the polished one, the planner, the voice that could sell any story if you weren't paying close enough attention. "Mom, you're here," I thought. He stumbled, adjusting his stance. "I thought you weren't feeling well." I tilted my head slightly. "You told me the dinner was canceled," I said calmly. "You said Grace was sick." Grace blinked, her lips parting. I felt better this morning," she said too quickly. "How miraculous," I replied, glancing around the table. So many healthy faces for a canceled celebration. The tension in the room curled tighter than a coiled ribbon. A few guests looked down at their plates. Others watched with the kind of fascination people have when they witness something both shameful and inevitable. Caleb, ever the gentleman, pulled out an empty chair near the center of the table, between Owen and a young woman I assumed was his girlfriend. He didn't ask permission. He didn't need to. I sat down, not because I was invited, but because I belonged. The linen napkin was stiff beneath my fingers. I smoothed it across my lap as if everything were perfectly normal, as if I hadn't spent 3 days spiraling through doubt, grief, and a silent reckoning that had shaken the very core of who I thought I was to them. Elliot sat slowly. His jaw was tense. Daphne's eyes flickered between me and her glass, her fingers tight around the stem like she was afraid it might slip. I could feel the weight of every unsaid thing hanging above the table like fog, and then I reached into my purse. "I didn't come to ruin your evening," I said softly, my voice steady as stone. "I came to see it for myself, to make sure I wasn't mistaken, that I hadn't been forgotten, that this wasn't simply some oversight or scheduling error." I placed the white envelope on the table gently, like it might bruise the linen. Owen looked at it confused. Elliot's eyes narrowed. Daphne paled. "I brought a few things with me," I added. "Just in case." No one spoke. No one moved. And I didn't open the envelope. Not yet. I folded my hands in my lap and looked around the table one more time. Not with rage, not with sorrow. With clarity. With choice. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a mirror. And I intended for them to look. I sat still for a moment longer, letting the envelope rest where I had placed it. Centered, deliberate quiet. They didn't move. No one touched a fork. The only sound was the faint murmur of another party echoing from the other side of the building, distant and irrelevant. "I brought a few things with me," I repeated softly. "Just in case this wasn't an oversight, just in case this was exactly what it now appears to be." I unfolded the flap of the envelope slowly and pulled out the first document. My fingers didn't shake. They had earlier at home, but not now. Not in front of them. "This," I said, laying the first paper gently on the table, "is confirmation that I sold the house." 3 days ago. A hush fell over the table like dust settling after a collapse. The house I added that you both asked me to sign over to you. The one you planned to remodel, rent out, flip maybe. It's gone. A young couple bought it. Just married, expecting a baby. They're thrilled. It'll be their first home." Daphne gasped. Elliot's mouth parted, but no words came out. I reached again into the envelope. "And this," I continued, placing the second sheet down, "is a receipt for a donation. Nearly $500,000. All from the sale." Grace turned pale. I heard a fork clatter to the table. "The money has gone to Willowbrook Public Library. They're building a new children's wing in Thomas's name. You remember your father, how he read to both of you every night no matter how tired he was, how he believed a story could change the shape of a child's life." I paused just for a breath. "They're naming it the Thomas Glenn Children's Wing. Construction begins next month." A few chairs shifted. One woman I didn't recognize put a hand over her mouth. Across the table, Owen sat perfectly still, his eyes wide, unblinking. I reached for the third and final document. "And this," I said, laying it flat between the two others, "is my revised will. What little remains. My savings, personal belongings, any possessions of sentimental or financial value, will go to Owen." I looked at him then directly. The only person at this table who visited me without needing something. Who came not for help but for pie, and stories, and time. Owen's face turned pink with shock, but he didn't speak. He looked stunned. Not at the gift, but at the revelation of what everyone else had failed to give. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. Elliot finally cleared his throat, voice low and tight. "Mom, you didn't have to." "I did. I interrupted. Because I needed to be free." Grace stared down at her napkin. Daphne was blinking fast, her lower lip trembling. "You wanted a party without me," I said. "Still even. Now you have one, But you also have the truth. I scanned their faces. Not in search of remorse, but recognition. I didn't find much of either. For years I continued, I gave everything I had. My time, my energy, my presence. I showed up for every recital, every stomach bug, every phone call that came too late at night. And as soon as I became inconvenient, too slow, too old, too much. This is how I was handled. Mom, Daphne began, her voice cracked. I raised my hand gently but firmly. I'm speaking now. She fell silent. I'm not angry, I said. I'm done being angry. I'm just finished being small. Finished begging to be included in a life I poured myself into. Owen looked between us all like he was watching a ship sink from the shore. I didn't come here to humiliate you, I said softly. I came to reclaim my place in the story, to write the ending myself. Elliot's eyes darted to the envelope, as if there might be some clause, some reversal, some back door left open. There's no negotiation, I added, catching the glance. The contracts are signed. The donation is public. The will is notarized. This isn't a threat. It's already done. I let the silence return, let it sit with them. I wish things were different, I said finally, but I no longer wish them enough to shrink myself. Then I stood, slowly, deliberately. I won't keep you from your celebration. This moment, this table. It's what you chose. And now I've chosen too. As I turned, I felt taller than I had in years. Not because I had won, but because I had walked away from something that no longer fit, and that took more strength than I thought I still possessed. No one stopped me. No one tried to follow. Only Owen looked up with tears in his eyes, and the words caught in his throat. I offered him a soft smile. Enjoy your evening, sweetheart. You deserve to be here. Then I walked toward the door, and the silence behind me said more than their words ever could. I didn't look back. Not when I stepped out of the banquet hall. Not when the heavy doors closed quietly behind me. Not when I passed the warm flicker of candles, the gentle hum of music returning to the room like nothing had happened. I simply walked. Caleb waited in the hallway, hands gently clasped, eyes soft with something between apology and admiration. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Instead, he nodded once, quiet, respectful, and offered his arm as he had before. Outside, the air had cooled. The breeze was gentler than I remembered, as if the world had exhaled for me. At the curb, the cab was already waiting. Its headlights spilled yellow light across the pavement, softening the shadows. I called it just before you walked in, Caleb said as he opened the door for me. Figured you might not want to linger. I looked at him then, really looked, and saw not just the man who used to borrow books from Thomas when he was a boy, but someone who had grown into quiet decency. That kind of person is rare in the world, rarer still when you need them most. Thank you, I said, not just for the ride, but for letting me walk through that door with dignity intact. He nodded again, then gently closed the door behind me. The cab pulled away from the inn, its tires humming softly against the road. I sat back, my hands folded in my lap, the navy fabric of my dress smooth beneath my fingers. I could still hear the echo of my own voice from earlier, the way it didn't tremble, the way it didn't ask. I didn't feel triumphant. This wasn't a victory, but it wasn't defeat either. It was something else entirely. A release. The town rolled by outside the window in familiar blurs. The church with its soft yellow light, the diner where Thomas and I used to split coffee and a slice of pie on Saturday mornings, the pharmacy that still carried his favorite cough drops. All of it the same, and yet I was not. When I arrived home, the porch light had already turned on. The automatic timer Thomas installed years ago still worked like clockwork. I stepped out of the cab, gave the driver a quiet thank you, and climbed the steps slowly, the porch creaking beneath my shoes like an old friend clearing its throat. Inside, the house felt both empty and proud. It was still mine. For a few more days anyway. I kicked off my shoes and carried them in my hand as I walked through the hallway. In my bedroom, I hung the navy dress back on its padded hanger and zipped up the garment bag. I wasn't sure when I'd wear it again, if ever. I sat at my vanity, wiped off my lipstick, and ran a warm cloth over my face. The woman in the mirror looked exactly as she had hours ago, but lighter somehow. Not because the years had lifted, but because the weight of pretending had. I didn't sleep much that night, but I also didn't lie awake in sorrow. I drank tea. I read a few pages of a novel I'd been meaning to finish, and just before dawn I opened the windows and let the early spring air wash through the house. 3 days later, I moved. The new apartment wasn't large, just 2 rooms and a tiny kitchen tucked above the bakery on Walnut Street. But it was warm, clean, and had windows that let in the morning sun. Best of all, it was just across from the Willowbrook Library. I didn't keep much. A few clothes, my favorite books, a box of old letters. Thomas's tools, though I had no real use for them, they simply felt like part of the journey. I donated the rest or left it behind with a quiet blessing. There was no ceremony. No announcement. I didn't tell Elliot or Daphne. I didn't need to. This wasn't about them. I spent my first morning arranging books on the built-in shelf and placing a small vase of daisies on the windowsill. It didn't take long to settle in. That's the gift of age, I suppose. You learn to carry your home in your heart, not in square footage. By noon, I had unpacked every box. By evening, I had exhaled something I hadn't realized I'd been holding for decades. I wasn't grieving the absence of my children. I was releasing the version of myself who thought being needed was the same as being loved. There is a stillness that comes not from giving up, but from giving yourself permission to stop chasing. That stillness found me in that little apartment. Not loud, not sudden, just present. Like an old friend who had waited patiently outside until I was ready to open the door. For the first time in decades, I wasn't waiting for an invitation. I wasn't watching the phone. I wasn't wondering if I'd said too much or not enough. I wasn't hoping they'd come around. I wasn't waiting to be chosen. I had chosen myself, and I was finally blessedly free. The mornings in my new apartment came with a different kind of light. It wasn't filtered through lace curtains or softened by decades of memories. It was crisp and new, brushing across pale walls that hadn't yet absorbed the weight of time. There were no creaky floors, no dusty baseboards holding echoes of children's footsteps. Just quiet and choice. 3 times a week I walk across the street to the Willowbrook Public Library. The building itself is modest, but the people inside, they are the heartbeat of this little town. Miss Patterson, the head librarian, welcomed me with a hug and a clipboard the day after I moved in. "You're on the volunteer schedule, Mrs. Glenn," she said with a wink. "Kids' Corner. You've got the right voice for stories." I suppose I do. Years of bedtime tales and rainy day reading had trained it well. Now I read to toddlers on Tuesday mornings, help first graders, pick their very first chapter books on Thursdays, and simply listen on Fridays, when teens wander in after school with too much to say and nowhere safe to say it. There's a boy named Jonah who asks every week if dragons are real, and a girl named Lily who wants to know how books get their names. I answer what I can and wonder what Thomas would say to the rest. The staff treats me like I've always been there. I am not someone's mother or the woman who gave money. I am just Marjorie. A woman with soft cardigans, a kind voice, and a knack for remembering which child likes talking animals and which one only wants mysteries. The new wing is still under construction, but the banner outside already reads, "Coming soon." The Thomas Glenn Children's Wing, a place to grow wonder and begin. I visit the site sometimes during my lunch break, watch the workers lay bricks and raise beams. I don't need to supervise. I trust them. I just like being near it. It feels like Thomas is near, too. Owen visits most Wednesdays, same as always. He brings pastries from a place near his campus, usually still warm, and stories about classes, girls, and dreams that sound far off but possible. He asks questions like, "Do you ever wish you'd traveled more?" and listens like the answer matters. Sometimes he just sits beside me and reads our silence easy and full. Elliot calls now too. At first, the conversations were stilted, full of long pauses and unnecessary weather reports. Then slowly something softened. He asked how I was sleeping, then how the library was going. Last week he told me Grace had started volunteering at a senior center. I don't know if it's guilt or growth. Maybe both. But for now, I take the calls. I listen. I answer. I do not chase. Daphne came by once. She knocked gently, holding a bouquet of dahlias from her shop. She didn't say much, just handed them to me, stepped inside, and looked around the small apartment with curious eyes. Her gaze lingered on the bookshelf, on the framed photo of Thomas, near the window, on the mug Owen had gifted me, that read, "World's Wisest Grandma." She sat for tea. We talked about simple things. The weather, the bakery downstairs, how loud the construction could get in the mornings. She didn't apologize. I didn't ask her to. When she left, she hugged me tightly, like she wasn't sure if she'd be allowed to do it again. I don't shut them out, but I don't let them all the way in either. I've learned that boundaries are not walls. They're doors with locks. And I hold the key now. There are days I miss the old house, the creak of the porch, the worn armchair, the way sunlight painted the living room gold. But I don't miss the waiting. I don't miss the silence that used to hang in the corners, waiting for someone to notice I was still there. Here in this smaller life, I am larger, not louder, not brighter, but whole. I water my plants, I cook simple meals, I help children fall in love with stories, I wake up without wondering if I matter. Because I do, not for what I give, not for what I built, not even for what I left behind, but for who I am now. I don't expect them to understand that overnight, maybe not ever, but that's not my burden to carry anymore. Trust is no longer something I hand out like candy on Halloween. It's earned. And these days I've learned to save some of it for myself. The morning of the dedication ceremony arrived with a sky brushed in soft gold, the kind that makes everything look a little more forgiving. Spring had come to Willowbrook in full, and with it a kind of stillness I hadn't known in years. At exactly 3 minutes past 10, Owen knocked on my door. He wore a navy blazer that didn't quite fit at the shoulders, and a tie that leaned slightly to the left. In his hands was a paper-wrapped bouquet of lilies stems poking through the bottom. His hair was combed but already rebelling in the front. "You ready for your big moment, Grandma?" He grinned. I laughed, smoothing the skirt of the navy dress, the same one I had worn that night at the Birchwood Inn, but this time it didn't feel like armor. It felt like a beginning. "It's not a big moment," I said, reaching for my purse. "Just a ribbon and a plaque?" "No," Owen replied. "It's more than that. It's a legacy." Outside the town square was already filling. Folding chairs lined the walk in front of the library's new wing white with green bows tied at each corner. Children darted around their parents' legs. Librarians adjusted clipboards and stacks of donated books, and the mayor was busy shaking hands like he was campaigning again. I could see it from across the street. The construction fencing now gone, the final bricks in place, a silky white cloth draped over the plaque that would bear Thomas's name. Miss Patterson waved us over with a bright smile. "Marjorie." Right on time. She ushered us to the front row, her hand warm on my back. The town's been waiting for this. And frankly, so have I. I nodded, my eyes already searching the crowd. Not for praise, but for something else. Something quieter. And there they were. Standing near the back, not close enough to speak, but not far enough to pretend they weren't part of this. Elliot and Daphne. He wore a charcoal suit, his shoulders slightly hunched. She held a small bouquet, nothing showy, just soft wildflowers in a paper cone. They didn't wave, didn't push forward, but they came. That was enough. The mayor stepped up to the podium first. He spoke of community, of giving back, of the library's importance to the children of Willowbrook. He kept it short. For once. Then Miss Patterson took the mic, and her words were softer. We all knew Thomas Glenn, she began. We knew his quiet smile and the way he'd disappear into the non-fiction shelves for hours. We knew how he loved stories and how much he loved his family. She looked over at me and smiled gently. And we know Marjorie, the woman who gave us this gift. Not for attention, not for applause, but because she believes, like Thomas did, that the heart of a town lives in the hands of its children. She stepped back, her voice catching just slightly, and gestured for me to come forward. I stood slowly, my hands not trembling for once. "Thank you all for being here," I said into the microphone. The breeze tugged gently at the hem of my dress, and a small child laughed somewhere behind me. "This wing is named after my husband Thomas," I began. He believed in the power of books and in the quiet magic of a story read aloud to a child. He believed that reading didn't just build minds, it built people. I paused, scanning the crowd until I found Owen again. His eyes held mine. He read to our children every night, even when he was tired, even when the world had been heavy that day. He believed that a well-loved book could teach you how to be braver, kinder, and most of all, how to imagine something better. A gust of wind caught the edge of the cloth on the plaque. Someone reached to hold it down. "My hope is that this space will do the same for generations to come," I said. "That every child who walks through those doors will find a corner where they feel safe, a story where they feel seen. And maybe, just maybe, a dream that feels a little closer." The crowd was quiet for a moment, then applause rose slowly, genuine and full. Owen stepped up beside me, handing me the scissors with a grin. "Time to cut the ribbon, Grandma." We turned together. I took the handles, felt the satin press between the blades, and snipped. The white cloth dropped away from the plaque. And there it was, the Thomas Glenn Children's Wing, in honor of a life lived with quiet love and lasting impact. The letters shimmered in the sunlight, warm and sure. I stared at them for a long moment, something in my chest rising slowly like breath at the end of a held note. Behind me, I heard someone sob quietly. I didn't turn to see who. Owen slipped his hand into mine. "You did it," he whispered. "No," I replied, squeezing his fingers. "We did." As the crowd dispersed and people began exploring the new wing, I stood beside the plaque just a little longer, watching as parents led their children through the doors, as toddlers ran excitedly toward shelves too tall for them, as volunteers placed books in fresh cubbies. From the corner of my eye, I saw Elliot approach slowly. Daphne followed a few steps behind. They didn't interrupt. They didn't ask for anything. And I didn't offer. Not yet. Instead, I stayed where I was, with the sun warm on my shoulders and the name of the man I loved gleaming just above eye level. And for the first time in my life, I felt not like the one who had been left behind, but the one who had stayed and still found something beautiful waiting for her. Weeks passed after the ribbon cutting, but the warmth of that day lingered like sunlight on a windowsill. Life didn't change in dramatic ways. No grand reconciliations, no surprise visits or teary apologies, just quiet. And that was enough. I still wake early. The bakery downstairs begins bustling before the sun is fully up, sending the scent of rising dough and cinnamon into the hallway. I've come to love it. The smell reminds me that something is always being made new. At the library, the children have started calling me Miss Marjorie, like I work there full-time. I don't correct them. I help organize craft supplies, read about dragons and planets and friendship, and refill juice cups when someone's gone too long without asking for what they need. Sometimes I watch parents waiting at the door, phones in hand, coats unzipped. And I wonder what kind of parent I had been, what kind of presence I still might be even now. But the wondering no longer aches. It just passes through. Louis stops by every so often, always unannounced, always with a paper cup of chai in one hand and some comment about the weather or a book he's pretending to read. The first time I thought he was just being kind. The second time I started saving a chair by the window. We've gone to the community theater twice now. Once for a play about a lighthouse keeper, once for a musical neither of us understood, but both enjoyed. Last Thursday, he invited me to dinner with his sister. Just a small meal, he said, nothing fancy. I wore a cardigan I hadn't touched in years and brought along a jar of peach preserves as a hostess gift. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't anything that needed defining. It was steady, mutual. The kind of companionship that doesn't ask to be filled, but simply shared. For the first time in decades, I let someone in without expecting them to fix anything. I didn't need fixing. I just needed space to be seen as whole again. Elliot calls sometimes. Short conversations about weather errands, and now and then something more human. Grace is volunteering more. They adopted a rescue dog. He sent me a photo last week. An old mutt with tired eyes and a gray snout. I smiled when I saw it. Daphne sent a birthday card. A real one. In an envelope. She didn't sign it with love, just her name, but she remembered the date. That used to be enough. And now, oddly, it still is. I don't shut them out, but I don't leave the door wide open either. The truth is, I no longer need them to understand the shape of the wound. I just needed to stop pretending it wasn't there. Some nights, I sit by the window with my tea and watch the world go by. I see students hurrying home, couples walking hand in hand, kids carrying backpacks twice their size. Sometimes I imagine what Thomas would think of all this. The library wing, the apartment, the quiet I've built. I think he'd be proud, not because I donated money or made a speech, but because I remembered how to live without waiting for permission, because I remembered how to be mine. This life, this small, tender, unexpected life, isn't what I imagined, but it is mine. Entirely. It's slow mornings with books and no rush. It's children asking if unicorns are real and teenagers whispering about heartbreak. It's tea with someone who knew you before the world chipped away at your softness. It's choosing your own voice after years of being the echo. And it's no longer being afraid to be alone, because alone isn't the same as unloved. I think back sometimes to the night at Birchwood Inn, the moment I stepped through those doors not to demand a seat but to see with my own eyes what I had been left out of. I don't regret it. Not the house and not the money, not even the silence that came afterward. Because all of it brought me here. And here is enough. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if Elliot and Daphne will ever fully understand how much they hurt me, or how long they did without even noticing. But I'm no longer waiting for that. I'm no longer waiting to be asked, or chosen. Because this life, this quiet, beautiful, unpromised life, it's mine now. And I intend to live every last page of it on my own terms. If you've ever felt like you were the one left out, like your love was taken for granted the moment it stopped being convenient, then maybe you saw a piece of yourself in Marjorie's story. Have you ever had to choose peace over proximity to let go? Not out of anger, but out of dignity. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if your child told you dinner was canceled only to find everyone else gathered without you? Please take a moment to leave a comment. Your words might be the comfort someone else is searching for tonight. And if this story spoke to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another journey like this. Because every woman deserves to feel seen, heard, and remembered. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and never forget the quiet power of choosing yourself. Mem.